You okay,
She
sweetheart?
used to know exactly
I'm
how to
just
leave a
sad,
place.
Daddy.
It was
I
one of the
know.
first things she
It's a
had
lot,
learned not from a
but we'll be
manual,
okay.
not from
Promise?
training,
I
but from
promise.
a childhood spent watching her father pack a house into boxes with the quiet efficiency of a man who had accepted that nothing was permanent. She had inherited the skill completely. She could assess a space, identify what mattered, and be gone before the attachment had time to set. She had done it 11 times before Seoul. She had not done it since. If you are new here, this is part 3. Go back and watch from the beginning. Because what these two people built did not happen overnight, and you need to feel the weight of it before you understand what this part means. 8 months. That was how long it had been since the Yoon situation resolved, since the night he came to her door in Yongsan and stood in the hallway and they looked at each other without words, because the relief of the other person being present was more immediate than language. 8 months since she had stopped thinking of his apartment as his apartment. It had not been a decision. That was the thing about it. There had been no conversation, no agreement, no moment where either of them looked at the other and said, "This is where you live now." It had happened the way rivers find their level incrementally, inevitably without drama. Her books had arrived first. A small stack she had brought over one evening because she was midway through 2 of them, and it seemed impractical to keep moving them back and forth. They had found space on the lower shelf next to his, and neither of them had commented on it. Then, a drawer. Then, the particular coffee she preferred, which appeared in the kitchen one morning without discussion. Then, the gray sweater she had left on the back of the chair, and never taken home, because the chair had begun to feel like a reasonable place for it. Then her routines, the morning ones especially, the way she moved through the kitchen before he was fully awake, the particular sequence of her coffee first, then the window, then the book, then the slow emergence into the day. He had learned it without being taught. He moved around it. He poured her coffee before his own without appearing to think about it, set it at the left side of the island where she always sat, and returned to whatever he was reading with the easy economy of a man performing a habit so established it no longer required attention. She had noticed the first time he did it. She had not said anything. She had picked up the cup and looked at the side of his face and felt something settle in her chest, quiet and specific, and so thoroughly without complication that it had, paradoxically, unsettled her entirely. That was 8 months ago. She was no longer unsettled. The consulting firm had grown. She had not intended to build something. She had taken the position with the quiet pragmatism she brought to most decisions. It was the right move professionally. It gave her independence and standing. It allowed her to contribute meaningfully to the work she understood best. That was sufficient reason. But the work had been good. Better than good. 2 major clients in the first quarter, a third by month 5, a referral network that had developed with the organic momentum of quality compounding. By the time she was 8 months out of Seojun's detail, she had 2 analysts working under her, and more incoming work than she could take on alone. She told him about it on a Tuesday evening. Not to seek approval, she had made her own professional decisions for her entire adult life, and did not need that to change. But because she had come to understand, slowly, that sharing good things with him was not the same as seeking permission for them. It was something else. Something she did not have a clean word for, but which felt like the difference between a house with 1 window and a house with 2. He had listened without interruption, asked 2 precise questions that demonstrated he had understood not just the facts but the implications, and then he said quietly, "You built that." Just that. She had looked at him across the kitchen island with the lamp throwing its warm light between them, and felt the particular weight of being seen correctly by someone who had no professional reason to see you at all. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He returned to his papers. She had stayed at the island for a moment longer than necessary, looking at him, before she returned to her own work. They went out rarely, not because either of them avoided it, but because the apartment had become the place where neither of them had to be anything other than what they were, and that was, for 2 people who spent their professional lives performing composure, worth protecting. But there were evenings. A restaurant in Hanam they had discovered by accident in February, small, unhurried, the kind of place that understood the value of leaving people alone. A walk along the river on a Sunday that had started as 20 minutes and become 2 hours without either of them deciding to extend it. A night in March when they had driven without destination and ended up parked above the Han watching the city do its slow-lit reflection in the water, saying nothing for long stretches that did not feel like silences. The Hanam restaurant had become theirs the way certain things had become theirs, without ceremony, without announcement, simply through repetition, and the particular ease a place acquires when two people have stopped performing inside it. The owner knew them now, not their names. But he brought her tea without being asked because the first time she had ordered it he had filed it, and he gave Seo-jun the corner table with the wall at his back, which Seo-jun had never requested and never needed to. She had noticed that, on the third visit, the way the city accommodated him, quietly, without drama. The way rooms made space for him not out of fear anymore, or not only fear but out of the particular recognition that attaches to someone who has been a fixed point in a landscape for long enough to become part of the geography. She was part of that landscape now, too. She had understood this gradually, the way people looked at them. Not with the professional neutrality they had maintained for so long, that particular public invisibility she had worked to perfect in the months she was his bodyguard, but with the different quality of attention that attaches to two people who clearly, undeniably, belong to each other. It had unsettled her the first time she noticed it. She was not someone who had ever been half of something. She did not have a ready category for how it felt to be read that way from the outside. On a Tuesday evening in early April, they were at the Hanam restaurant, midway through dinner, when a man Seo-jun knew stopped at their table. Business acquaintance, she assessed immediately the particular careful warmth of someone who wanted something from him, but was patient about the wanting. He spoke to Seo-jun for 2 minutes about something operational. And then he looked at her. Not the way Daniel Wu had looked at her in Inchin, not assessment or assumption, just acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that she was present and relevant and not incidental. "I've heard good things about your firm," the man said. Specific. He had done his research. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once at Seo-jun, a nod that carried, she understood, a weight of implication about who she was and what she meant, and moved on. Seo-jun watched him go. Then he looked at her. "He checked you out professionally," he said. "Before tonight." "I know," she said. "Does that bother you?" She considered it honestly. "No," she said. "It would have once." He looked at her across the table with the attention that still, occasionally arrived without warning and made her feel thoroughly, entirely seen. "Why not now?" he said. She picked up her glass. "Because I know who I am in relation to you, and it's not a compromise of anything I built." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and his fingers rested briefly against her wrist, not a grip, barely contact, the lightest possible version of what it was, and he returned to his food. She looked at her wrist where his hand had been. Then she looked at him. Then she looked away first, because looking at him straight on in moments like that still, after 8 months, required a composure she was only intermittently able to perform. The domestic rhythms had arrived so gradually that she could not have named when any single one began. They simply existed now. The way furniture exists in a room you have lived in long enough, not noticed individually but immediately wrong if any piece were missing. He woke before her, always. She had come to understand this was not insomnia but temperament. He moved best in the early quiet before the day had positioned itself, reading or working or simply sitting at the window with his coffee while the city came to. She would surface an hour later to find the apartment already inhabited, already warm, already arranged by his presence in the particular way that she had stopped being able to separate from home. He cooked on evenings when neither of them had external commitments. Not elaborately, he was precise rather than inventive in the kitchen, the same quality he brought to everything, and his range was limited but reliable. She had learned not to offer help because he cooked the way he worked, with a focused self-sufficiency that wasn't exclusion, simply process. What she did instead was sit at the island and talk to him while he moved, and he answered without turning, and the conversation moved through the kitchen the way all their best conversations did, unhurried, without destination, landing places neither of them had planned. She had not known she was capable of this kind of quiet before him. She had understood herself as someone built for motion, for the clean geometry of professional spaces, for the kind of self-containment that looked from the outside like confidence, and was, from the inside, the specific loneliness of someone who had decided, very young, that needing things from people was a structural weakness. She was revising that understanding, slowly, without announcing it, the way she did all her most significant internal work. There had been a specific evening in January 4 months in, before she had fully acknowledged that the Yongsan apartment had become a formality, when she had understood something she had not been ready to name yet. She had woken at 2 in the morning for no reason. The apartment was dark and still, Seoul doing its muted winter breathing outside. Seo-jun was asleep beside her, on his side, one hand resting open near her shoulder, in the unconscious proximity she had come to understand was how he slept when she was there. She lay still, and looked at the ceiling and took a quiet inventory of herself the way she did sometimes, not anxiously, but with the methodical honesty of someone who had learned that self-knowledge was a form of safety. She had asked herself, in the dark, what would you do if this ended? It was the question she had always asked herself about things that mattered, as a check, the way you test a structure by imagining its absence. She had asked it about jobs, about cities, about the few friendships she had let herself build over the years. The answers had always been the same. I would manage. I would move. I would be fine. She asked it now. The answer did not come. She waited for it. She was patient, systematic. She always found the answer. But this time the question sat in the dark and returned nothing, because some part of her beneath the discipline, beneath the assessment, in the place she could not audit, refused to engage with the premise. She had lain there for a long time with that refusal. It was the most frightening thing that had happened to her in years, not because it meant she was weak. She understood herself well enough by now to know that needing someone was not the same as losing yourself to them. That had been her old equation, the one she had built in childhood out of watching impermanence and concluding that attachment was risk. What frightened her was not the needing. It was the depth of it, the way it had installed itself without her supervision, below the level where she made decisions, in the place where things become simply true before you have agreed to them. She had made a choice to stay. She had made it clearly, with full information, at a table in Yongsan with the city outside and the lamp between them. She was proud of that choice. It was one of the clearest things she had ever done. But lying in the dark in January, she had understood that the choice was no longer the relevant thing. The relevant thing was that she was no longer capable of making the opposite one. She had fallen asleep eventually. She had not told him. She had gotten up in the morning and made coffee and sat at the island and watched him read, and he had looked up and found her watching and said nothing, and she had looked away, and the day had continued. She had carried that night quietly, the way she carried most things not suppressed, but held, waiting for the moment it would tell her what it meant. She was beginning to understand what it meant. Rian came to dinner on a Thursday in April. This had happened 3 times now and had never been formally arranged. It emerged from operational necessity each time, a briefing that ran late, a decision that required Seo-jun's direct attention at an hour that coincided with the evening. But the first time Ryun had moved to leave at the natural conclusion of business, Seo-jun had said, without preamble, "Stay." And Ryun had looked at Simone across the table, with an expression she had come to read as his version of asking permission, and she had said, "There's enough," and that had been that. 3 times now. Ryun did not speak much at the table. This was not unusual, he did not speak much anywhere. But there was a quality to his silence over dinner that was different from his professional silence, less contained. The silence of a man who was, in some specific and private way, glad to be where he was. She had noticed it the first time and filed it without comment. On this Thursday he arrived at 7, handed her a bottle of wine with the formal efficiency of someone who had looked up the appropriate social gesture and executed it precisely, and sat at the table while Seo-jun finished in the kitchen. She poured him a glass. He looked at it, looked at her. "How is the firm?" "Growing," she said. "Faster than I planned." He nodded. "You flagged the East Corridor gap before I did." This was, she understood, Ryun's version of a compliment, possibly the highest one he had available. "You would have caught it," she said. "Later," he said. Simply. Seo-jun set the food on the table and sat, and the three of them ate in the particular comfortable quiet of people who had been through something real together and no longer needed to perform ease because the ease was actual. At some point during the second glass, Ryun looked across the table at Seo-jun with an expression she had never seen from him before. Not professional, not strategic, something much older and much more private. The expression of a man who had watched someone he cared about survive a version of themselves that might have been the final version, and was sitting in the quiet relief of having been wrong about that. Seo-jun caught it, said nothing. His hand moved across the table and rested briefly on the back of Simone's where it sat beside her glass. Not a gesture for Ryun, not a performance, simply automatic, the reach of a man whose body had learned where she was. Ryan looked away, picked up his glass. The moment closed. But she had felt it, the weight of it, the way it landed differently than it would have 8 months ago, when touch between them had still carried the particular electricity of the new and the uncertain. It still carried weight. But the weight was different now. It was the weight of something that had become structural. The way a load-bearing wall is not noticed until you understand what would happen if it were gone. After dinner, Ryun stood to leave with the same formal efficiency he had arrived with. He put on his coat. He looked at the table, then at her, then at Seo-jun. Good food, he said. Which was, she had come to understand, Ryun's version of, thank you for letting me be here. Seo-jun walked him to the door. She stayed at the table and listened to the low exchange of voices in the hallway, brief, operational, the natural register of two men who had spent years communicating in the minimum required syllables. Then the door. Then Seo-jun returning. He sat back down across from her, poured the last of the wine into her glass. Did not ask if she wanted it. He knew she did the way he knew most things about her now, without requiring confirmation. She looked at him across the remains of the dinner. He needs this, she said. Not a question. Seo-jun looked at the door. He doesn't have much else. I know. She picked up the glass. We should do it more often. He looked at her. Something moved in his eyes, the quiet version of surprise, the one that arrived when she said something that landed in a place he hadn't prepared. Yes, he said. They sat for a while longer without clearing the table, which was something she had learned about him. He did not rush the end of an evening. He let things finish at their own pace. It had seemed at first like patience. She understood now it was something else. A man who had spent years moving through life at the speed of threat and calculation, finally, slowly, learning how to simply be inside a moment without managing it toward the next one. She was teaching him that without knowing she was teaching it. He was learning it without knowing he was learning it. That was how the best things happened between them. He had nightmares sometimes. She had known this for 4 months. He woke from them quietly, no sound, no dramatic surfacing, simply a sudden stillness that was different from sleep stillness, and which she had learned, after the second time, to recognize in the dark. He never told her about them. She never asked. What she did, what she had begun to do without deciding to, sometime around the 3rd or 4th time, was move her hand to his arm in the dark, lightly, without waking fully herself. Just contact, just the simple information of another person present. He would go still for a moment, and then he would exhale, and his hand would come over hers where it rested on his arm, and neither of them would speak, because there was nothing to say. She had thought about those moments in the daylight once, tried to find the right category for them. The closest she had come was this. They were the moments that happened beneath the level of performance. Below choice, almost. The place where you discovered what you actually were to someone, because neither of you was managing it. She was the thing that his body reached for in the dark when the mind was not yet awake enough to decide anything. She had held that quietly, without saying it. There was an afternoon in March that she returned to sometimes, the way you return to certain photographs, not because anything dramatic occurred, but because the ordinary quality of it was the most precise evidence she had of how far he had come. She had come home to find him on the phone, standing at the window, which was where he stood when the call required full attention. She set her bag down and moved to the kitchen and began making coffee, and did not try to read the conversation, not out of professional discipline this time, but because it was his, and that distinction had taken her longer to learn than she expected. The call ended. He came to the kitchen. She slid his cup across the island without looking up from her own. He stood beside her and drank it and said after a moment, "That was Ryun. There's a situation in Busan. I'll need to be there Thursday." "How long?" she said. "2 nights. Possibly 3. She nodded. "Tell me if it changes." "I will." She looked up then. He was watching her with the expression she had come to think of as his unguarded one. Not the composed boardroom face, not the flat professional register, but the specific way he looked at her in the kitchen in the afternoon when nothing was required of either of them. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. The same word, the same flat delivery, but his eyes held hers for 1 beat longer than necessary. He went back to the window. She returned to her coffee. That was all. 14 sentences between them about logistics and the unremarkable domestic choreography of 2 people moving around a shared kitchen. But she thought about it afterward because of what it was not. There had been no management of her response, no carefully edited version of the information, no calculation of what she needed to know versus what he had decided to protect her from. He had told her directly, completely, without the architecture of control that used to live between them like a third presence in every room. He had simply told her, and then waited without performance to see how she received it. That was the transformation. Not dramatic. Not the stuff of declarations or confrontations or moments that anyone would have written down. Just a man in a kitchen, telling the truth. The way people who trust each other tell the truth without the particular exhaustion of deciding how much. She had not said any of this to him. She didn't need to. He already knew what it cost him to be this way. She already knew what it meant that he was. That was enough. She noticed the first thing on a Wednesday morning. Small, easily attributed to other causes. She was tired in a way that sat differently than ordinary tiredness, not in the muscles, not behind the eyes, but somewhere lower and more interior, the tiredness of something happening rather than something depleted. She noted it, filed it in the part of her mind that kept observations before they had sufficient data to become conclusions. She went to work. She ran a full-day assessment for a client in Mapo, ate lunch at her desk, took the train back to Gangnam in the early evening. She was precise and focused and professionally complete throughout, because this was who she was regardless of what she was quietly carrying. That night, Seo-jun cooked while she sat at the island. She watched him move through the kitchen with the focused economy she had memorized without trying to. The particular way he moved when he was thinking about something and also, simultaneously, doing something which was always, she had come to understand. He did not have idle states. But the thinking had become less weighted over these months. The set of his shoulders was different than it had been when she first knew him. Not looser exactly. More like a structure that had redistributed its load and was carrying the same weight more efficiently. She had done that, she understood. She was part of what had shifted. "You're quiet," he said without turning. "I'm always quiet," she said. "Differently quiet." She looked at the back of his head. "I'm just tired." He turned then, not sharply the turn of a man checking something he had decided to check rather than reacting. He looked at her for a moment with the thorough attention that still, after all this time, had the capacity to feel like being read at a cellular level. "Eat first," he said, "then sleep." "I wasn't planning not to," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. He turned back to the stove. She looked at the island in front of her and felt the second small thing a faint and specific nausea, brief, arriving and departing without drama. The kind that could be attributed to an empty stomach or a long day or nothing at all. She attributed it to the long day. She ate. He sat across from her and they talked about a contact of his in Incheon, a restructuring she had thoughts on, a book she had finished the night before that he had been meaning to read. The conversation moved the way it always moved between them, without performance, without agenda, landing in unexpected places. At some point his hand came across the table and covered hers, the way it did sometimes, the unconscious claim that she had stopped noticing in the way you stop noticing the foundation of a building. It was simply there. It was simply true. She looked at his hand on hers and felt, for a moment, the strange vertigo of looking at something too familiar to see clearly. She went to sleep early. He stayed up, as he often did, the lamp in the corner throwing its warm light across the floor of the room she now thought of as theirs without having to work at it. She was asleep before she heard him come to bed. The third thing arrived on a Saturday. She was standing in the kitchen, her coffee in her hand, looking out the window at the city doing its slow Saturday morning conversation with itself. Seojin was at the table behind her with a newspaper, an actual newspaper, which had struck her as charmingly anachronistic the first time she noticed it, and now simply struck her as his reading with the focused quiet he brought to everything. She had slept deeply and well, and woken to find his arm across her waist. The unconscious anchor she had come to understand was how he slept beside her. He had not been fully awake when she rose. She had moved carefully, not wanting to disturb it. She was standing at the window with her coffee and the city below and the knowledge sitting quietly in the center of her chest, not yet examined, not yet named, and she heard him turn a page behind her. Such a small sound. Such a completely ordinary Saturday morning sound. And something happened in her chest at the sound of it that she could not account for with any ordinary explanation. Not love, she knew what that felt like now, and this was beyond it, underneath it, older than it. Something that was not about feeling, but about fact. About the specific recognition that this sound, this particular turn of this particular page, in this particular kitchen, in this particular morning light, was a sound she needed to continue hearing, not wanted. Needed. She stood very still. Outside, Seoul continued its indifferent Saturday business. A bus. Voices from the street below, the ordinary textures of a city that did not know or care that something was shifting in a kitchen on the 14th floor. She set her coffee down carefully on the counter. Her hand, when she withdrew it, moved not entirely voluntarily to rest just below her sternum. The gesture was light, barely there. The gesture of a woman whose body had arrived at a question before her mind had formed the words. She did not move for a long moment. Behind her, Seojin turned another page. She thought about the January night, the dark ceiling, the question she had asked and the answer that refused to come. She had carried that night for 3 months, turning it over quietly, waiting for it to resolve into language. Standing at the window now, she understood it was not going to resolve into language. It had resolved into something else entirely, something physical and factual and interior, something that existed below the level of decision and would not be argued with or filed or managed. She had spent her whole life being the person who could manage anything. She was looking at the limit of that. Her hand pressed slightly, without her deciding to press it. Just wait. Just the instinct of a body telling the mind what it already knew. She thought about what it would mean. The shape of it. The specific upheaval of a life already being reconstructed. A world already complicated. A man already carrying more than most people could hold. She thought about all the practical things, the ones her mind would normally reach for first, building the structure of a decision before the emotion had time to arrive. But the practical things felt distant this morning. They would arrive later. She would think through them clearly, as she did everything, with the discipline that had never failed her. Right now she was just standing at a window on a Saturday morning, with the city below and her hand against herself and the man she had spent so long protecting herself from loving reading the newspaper 5 feet away. She thought about her father, the boxes, the bases, the childhood understanding that nothing was permanent. She had built her entire adult life on that premise. She had made it into a strength, made it into a career, made it into the clean, self-sufficient geometry of a woman who knew how to leave before anything could require her to stay. And then she had come to Seoul, and stayed, and stayed, and stayed. Not because she had decided to stay, because at some point, without either of them marking the moment, this apartment and this man and these mornings and the sound of that newspaper turning had become the place where she was most completely, most honestly, most irrevocably herself. And now, something else. Something that changed the geometry entirely. Behind her, Seojun turned another page. She picked up her coffee. Turned. He was at the table with his newspaper and his reading glasses. She had teased him about the glasses exactly once, and he had looked at her with such specific reproach that she had filed the information and never raised it again, which was also something she loved about him, and the morning light was coming through the window and falling across the table and across his hands, and he had not yet looked up. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. He turned a page. His hand moved to his coffee cup. He drank without looking up. He was, in this moment, completely unaware of being observed, and because of that he was more purely himself than she ever saw him in rooms with other people, unguarded, undirected, simply present in his own Saturday morning in the way of a man who had, finally, a Saturday morning worth being present in. He had told her once so quietly she had almost missed it, that he had not known how to do this, that most things he knew how to do, that this was the exception. He knew how to do this now. She had watched it happen, month by month, small gesture by small gesture, the architecture of a shared life assembled so gradually that neither of them had a clear memory of any single brick being laid. And now, inside that architecture, something new. Something not yet named, not yet spoken, not yet handed to him in the form of words he would need to receive and respond to and carry. Not yet. But soon. He looked up, found her standing in the doorway, said nothing. The glasses, the newspaper, the morning light, and then, the corner of his mouth. That barely there thing she had now seen dozens of times and which still, every single time, made him look like someone she was only just being allowed to see. "Come here," he said. Not an order. The tone of a man addressing the specific person who was allowed inside the space he had spent his whole life keeping everyone out of. She crossed the kitchen. She sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder was against his, and he turned the newspaper toward her slightly, the unconscious sharing of someone who no longer thought of what he had as separate from what she had access to. And she leaned into him and felt his arm come around her with the automatic ease of a man reaching for the thing that was always, now, simply there. She looked at the newspaper without reading it. She thought, I should tell him. She thought, not yet. She thought, soon. And underneath both of those thoughts, quieter than either, the one that had no language and did not need it, he will be good at this. She did not know where that came from. She did not examine it. She simply held it in the warm quiet of the morning and let it be true. His arm tightened slightly around her. Barely. The smallest possible adjustment, the kind that said nothing and everything, the kind that in another language would take a whole sentence. She sat in the warm quiet of a Saturday morning in a city she had arrived in without intending to stay, beside a man she had spent so long protecting herself from wanting that she had not noticed, until it was already entirely true, that she had stopped. The city moved below them, the lamp in the corner, his arm around her, the newspaper, the coffee going slowly cold on the counter where she had left it. And somewhere below the level of language, below the level of decision, in the place where the truest things about a person live before they have learned to say them, something settled. Something that felt, for the first time in her life, not like an ending and not like a beginning, but like the quiet, irreversible middle of a life she was no longer capable of imagining without him in it. The future did not feel like something approaching from a distance. It felt like something already in the room, already here, already home. And somewhere in the quiet of that understanding, in the space between his arm around her and the city outside, and the lamp in the corner and the newspaper and the life assembled so gradually, neither of them had seen it becoming permanent. She let herself stop being afraid of any of it. Not the complication, not the unknowing, not the conversation still to come. She let it all be true at once. That was new. That was the thing she had not known she was capable of until right now, in this kitchen, on this ordinary Saturday morning, letting something be completely, irreversibly true without needing to manage the weight of it first. She rested her head against his shoulder. He did not comment on it. He turned a page. Outside, Seoul moved through its morning, indifferent and alive and full of everything still to come. Inside, it was very quiet. The nausea arrived properly on a Monday. Not the brief, dismissible kind she had attributed to long days and empty stomachs. This was different. She woke before the alarm, before the city, before Seojun, and lay still for approximately 4 seconds before she understood that stillness was not going to be sufficient. She made it to the bathroom quietly. She was precise about it. She was precise about everything, including this. And when it was over, she sat on the cool tile floor with her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and let the information settle. Her body was not asking a question anymore, it was giving her an answer. She heard him stir in the bedroom. She heard the particular quality of his stillness that meant he was listening for her. She steadied her breathing, stood, rinsed her face with cold water, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Same eyes, same face, same woman who had arrived in this city not knowing she was going to stay. Everything different. "Simone?" His voice from the other side of the door. Not alarmed, quiet, the specific tone he used when he was giving her room, but needed to know she was there. "I'm fine," she said. "Go back to sleep." A pause. "It's 5:40. I know what time it is." Another pause. Longer. She could feel him deciding not to push it, which was its own form of evidence about how far he had come. "Coffee's on," he said finally. She heard him move away from the door. She looked at herself in the mirror for one more moment. Then she opened it. He left for Busan on Thursday morning. She stood in the hallway and watched him put on his jacket, the dark one, the one she had once catalogued as part of a professional assessment and now simply thought of as his, and he turned and looked at her with the expression she had learned was his version of goodbye. Not sentimental, just present, the look of a man who had learned slowly to let people know they were seen before he left a room. "2 nights," he said. "Possibly 3. "I know," she said. "You told me." The corner of his mouth. He crossed the hallway and stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment, the thorough look, the reading at a cellular level look, and something moved in his eyes that told her he was still filing the Monday morning, still turning it over quietly, still not asking because she hadn't offered, and he had learned the difference between giving her space and abandoning her to it. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, unhurried, deliberate, the kind of touch that carried everything he was not yet saying. Then he left. She stood in the hallway after the door closed and pressed her fingers to her forehead where his lips had been, and stood very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag, went to the pharmacy 2 streets over, and bought what she had been putting off buying for 5 days. She did it in the apartment bathroom. His bathroom. Their bathroom. She set the test on the edge of the sink and stood with her back against the opposite wall and looked at the window instead of the counter. Outside, a plane traced a slow white line across the October sky. Below, the city moved through its Thursday morning without any awareness of what was happening on the 14th floor. She did not pray. She did not bargain. She did not discover in that moment that she was more frightened than she had understood. She had always known what she wanted. That had never been the part she struggled with. She looked at the window and thought about her father, packing boxes. She thought about the 11 cities. She thought about arriving in Seoul in October with her bag and her discipline and her practiced unreadability and the absolute private certainty that she would not be here long. She had been here almost 2 years. She looked at the counter. 2 lines. She stood very still. Not from shock. From the specific weight of something you have been quietly carrying becoming, in a single moment, undeniably, irrevocably real. She picked it up, looked at it with the same focused attention she brought to intelligence reports and threat assessments and every other piece of information that required her to understand exactly what she was holding. She understood exactly what she was holding. She set it back down. She sat on the edge of the tub and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and looked at the tile floor and let herself feel the full size of it without managing it into something smaller. The way she had learned to do, the way he had, without knowing he was teaching her, made possible the simple, radical act of letting something be as large as it actually was. It was large. It was the largest thing that had ever happened to her. And underneath the size of it, quieter than everything else, so quiet she almost didn't hear it, relief, pure and specific and completely unexpected. She sat with that for a long time. Then she stood up, washed her face, looked at herself in the mirror. "All right," she said. To herself. To the room. To the particular version of her life that was now beginning. Then she went to make coffee and figure out how to tell the most controlled man she had ever known that control was about to become entirely beside the point. He came back on Saturday evening. She heard his key in the door and felt her heart do something she had no professional category for. She was in the kitchen, where she had stationed herself because the kitchen felt like neutral ground, and she needed neutral ground for this. He came in, set his bag down, looked at her across the apartment with the particular attention that missed nothing. "You look different," he said. "I made dinner," she said. He looked at the table, then back at her. He was reading her face, and she knew he was reading her face, and she also knew that, for once, she was not entirely certain what he was finding there, because she was not entirely certain what was on it. He came into the kitchen. He stood beside her and looked at the stove, the table, the careful arrangement of a meal she had spent more attention on than was strictly necessary. "Simone," he said, quietly. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He watched her carry the food to the table and sit across from him and pour water into both glasses and set the jug down carefully. She looked at him. He looked at her. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. He said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. His face was composed. His eyes were doing the other thing, the full, pressed attention of a man who had learned that what she said next mattered, and that the correct response to things that matter was to be completely, entirely present for them. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She set the test on the table between them. She watched his eyes move to it, watched them stay there, watched the composed face do something she had never seen it do. Not fracture, not collapse, but open, the way a window opens, the way light enters a room that has been closed for a very long time. He looked up at her. She nodded. Once. Steady. And Kang Seo-jun, the most feared man in a city full of men worth fearing, the man who had spent his entire adult life keeping everything at a distance calculated precisely enough to guarantee his own survival, pushed back from the table, crossed to her side in 3 steps, and lifted her out of the chair. Not carefully. Not with the controlled precision he brought to everything. Completely. His arms came around her and he lifted her, and she felt the sound before she heard it. Something that began in his chest, low and involuntary. Something that had never once appeared in 14 months of professional distance or 8 months of careful becoming. Something that was not a word and did not need to be. Pure, uncontained. Joy. She pressed her face into his neck and felt him laugh, actually laugh, the full, unguarded version she could count on one hand, and his arms tightened around her, and he turned with her, right there in the kitchen between the table and the stove, and she felt the particular quality of his body in that moment. All the control released at once, every calculated distance collapsed into this single unrepeatable turning in the kitchen of the apartment that had begun as his and had become, without ceremony, theirs. "Seo-jun," she said into his neck. "I know," he said. His voice was not even, not close to even. The voice of a man operating below the level of composure, in the place where he had not allowed anyone in a very long time. "I know." He set her down. He held her face in both hands, and she thought, briefly, of the first time he had done this, in the room in Yeoksum, with unsteady hands and the city outside and everything still unresolved between them. His hands were not steady now either, but this was different. This was not the unsteadiness of a man trying to hold himself together. This was a man who had stopped needing to. He looked at her with an expression she had no category for and did not need one. Something beyond the language of the controlled and the careful and the precise. Something older than all of that. "Are you—" he started. "Yes," she said. "Both of you." "Both of us," she said. He pressed his forehead against hers, stood there, the kitchen around them, the city outside, the lamp throwing its warm light across the floor. She felt him breathe. Once. Slow. The breath of a man who had built his entire life around the management of loss, and was standing, for the first time, in the presence of something that felt like its opposite. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "that I wanted this." She pulled back just enough to look at him. And now? He looked at her, all of her in the fullness of it. "Now," he said, "I can't imagine wanting anything else." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "You should probably sit down." "I'm fine," he said. "You're shaking," she said. He looked at his hands. He was, slightly. He looked back at her with the expression that was adjacent to the smile but warmer than she had ever seen it, more completely unguarded. "I'm fine," he said again, softer this time. She took his hand, led him back to the table, sat him down, sat beside him, close, her shoulder against his the way it was on Saturday mornings with the newspaper. He looked at the test still sitting on the table. Then he looked at her. Then he did something she had seen exactly twice in all the time she had known him. He smiled, fully, without the careful corner-of-the-mouth restraint, without the management of it. Just smiled. And she thought, looking at him, this man and this particular unrepeatable man, that this was what it had all been for. Every silent month, every managed distance, every resignation drafted and unsubmitted, every bathroom floor and every almost leaving and every moment she had talked herself out of wanting something she could not name. All of it had been the long route here, to this kitchen, this table, this man with his unsteady hands and his unguarded face and his whole careful life, cracked open by 2 lines on a small plastic test. She reached across and covered his hand with hers. He turned it over immediately, held it. Outside, Seoul did its permanent indifferent thing. Inside, everything was different. Everything was exactly right. "Leave a comment before you go." She stayed. She built something real. And now it is growing. Tell me, from the very beginning, when she made him jealous on purpose, did you believe it would end here? Because she didn't. And somehow that makes it even more beautiful.